Aloha, I am Christy Chadwick. I have a master's in deaf education from Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. During my program, I learned alongside audiologists to learn more about the science of the ear and also how devices work, such as hearing aids and cochlear implants. With this, I learned a method called listening and spoken language, or LSL. Now living in Hawaii, I run an organization called Hawaii Hears. My mission is to deliver services to families who have children diagnosed with hearing loss, who use hearing aids and cochlear implants. I also provide education and awareness to professionals in early intervention around language development for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. The main focus of Hawaii Hears is to provide support to families, to empower them and help them get what they need to be able to communicate with their child. In this series, we hear from audiologists, teachers of the deaf, parents of children who are deaf, and individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. If you want to learn more about my services or what Hawaii Hears offers, please visit hawaiihears.com. You can also donate by clicking the donate button at hawaiihears.com. Mahalo. Aloha. Today's interview features Melissa McNamara. She is a teacher of the deaf. Right now she works at an option school in California where she teaches in the preschool classroom for children who are deaf or hard of hearing using cochlear implants or hearing aids. In today's interview, we get to discuss a little bit about the differences of teaching children who are deaf versus teaching children who have autism. Melissa and I graduated from the same program, Washington University, and we get to reminisce about the things that we learned in the program and catch up a little bit of what has happened since then. And I hope that you enjoy learning more about teaching children who are deaf or hard of hearing and other ideas around early intervention for children with a hearing loss. All right. Hi, Melissa. Thank you
Hi.
so much for joining me today and talking to us about listening and spoken language and
Absolutely.
teaching children who are deaf or hard of hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been a while since we've talked. We are classmates, except you graduated a year before me at WashU.
Mhm.
So what's happening in your world right now? What are you doing?
So recently, I moved to Sacramento, California, and I am working in an option school or a non-public school for children with hearing loss. Option being the nationwide um, loose organization for schools that provide listening and spoken language services. And so I'm teaching preschool. I started in February, so this will be my first full school year at the school.
Awesome. And how many kids do you have in your class?
Currently, I have 9, but there's always, IDs being made and kids getting diagnosed, and so there's a chance I could have more. I had 12 last year, so I'll just
Wow.
anyone could come at any time.
Wow. And so is it just you alone with the 9 to 12 kids, or do you have other aides in there with you?
So, due to the student to teacher ratio rules of the state, I have one aide with me if I have more than, I think it's 5 children at a time.
Mm.
So, the way that our schedule works, we have 2 groups of children, and I see them in alternating order. And sometimes they're all in the classroom together. And when that happens, my aide is with me. And if not, she's taking the other group to music or recess or wherever they may be.
Mm. Awesome. Yeah. So the kids that you said are in your class, sometimes they're diagnosed late, sometimes they're diagnosed earlier in life. Is the late diagnosis due to a hearing loss coming later in life, or that they were just late ID'd?
Sometimes it's late ID, sometimes due to like progressive loss or, a later illness like meningitis. Sometimes it's that they were ID'd early, like maybe they failed their newborn hearing screening, but kind of fell through the cracks, or had other circumstances, other syndromes, illnesses, things that kind of took precedent health wise. And so sometimes we have kids who have had devices. Maybe they got hearing aids when they were a couple of months old, but they haven't been wearing them consistently, or they haven't been wearing them at all, or they haven't had services of any real kind. And so being that early intervention isn't always as strong as I think it really should be. The kids get to, get that time where they're not really getting much intervention, and then they come to us later.
Right. So many things happen during that birth to 3 where they can get lost in the mix of different, different situations, whether it's another diagnosis or family stuff or rural living or
right. And you really can tell, there's a big difference with kids who have been receiving services from an early age and kids who maybe haven't had anything and they come in with little to no language. And so I have a pretty broad array of levels of children in my class. I have some kids who are maybe saying a handful of words and some kids who are speaking in full sentences. So it's interesting to see how early intervention services, consistent device use, things like that really do affect the outcomes of these kids, even at an early age.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty powerful to learn. And it's something to communicate to most parents, is to say, like, consistent device wearing and early language exposure, and teaching them how to understand language early on is so important and key.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are any of your families, are you the babies born deaf to hearing parents, or any of your families in the deaf community?
I'm almost certain that of all the students, at least in my class and the pre-K class next to me, all of the parents are hearing.
Okay.
And I think it's safe to say that almost all of the families in our school, the children are born to deaf adults. Or sorry, the children are born to hearing adults.
Hearing adults. Okay, yeah. Which would make sense because the statistics are, what, 95% even? 97% of kids born deaf are born to hearing families. So that would make sense. And then they chose the listening and spoken language route.
Right.
Why do you think that they chose the listening and spoken language route?
I think that it has a lot to do, at least in the beginning, when families are trying to decide. They have the option to go tour different programs. The districts all provide programs, most of which are signing or total communication. But there are 3 listening and spoken language schools in the state of California. The one that I work at being probably the largest, I guess. And so when parents come to tour, I think they see children who are speaking, communicating effectively, children who are utilizing their devices to listen appropriately, and they can kind of see the differences in a setting like that versus a signing program where maybe they realize that's not the language we use, and so communication is going to be difficult, or the outcomes of the students overall, such as reading outcomes, high school graduation, job opportunities, just the fact that we live in a hearing world makes it really difficult to say that signing might be a better option. And it is for some families. I've worked with families where that is more appropriate for their child. Maybe they won't ever be verbal, or it just makes sense for them at the time. But I actually have a little girl in my class right now whose family chose signing, and then last year decided that she wasn't making as much progress as they'd like, and so they switched. So she's with me now. But I guess more to the point, it's pretty easy to see when you go into our school or any school that provides listening and spoken language how much more progress those students are making early on in their life, and how much more communication is happening, and really how much it affects the family.
Right, definitely. It's geared towards what's happening in the home, like what language is there, because what we're focused on as teachers of the deaf is giving that quality language exposure.
Right.
And if there's not quality sign language being used around the child, then they may not become fluent in that language.
Absolutely.
And then after that, all the things that you just talked about kind of diminish,
Yeah.
where they're reading the language, the math, the graduation.
Yeah. I actually read a statistic that if a baby and a deaf baby and their hearing parents start learning sign at the same time, that the student surpasses the adult by like age 4 or 5.
Wow.
So the language that child is able to understand and use is not the same level of language that their parents are. And so then you have communication breakdown in the home, which affects the child's well-being, their quality of life, things like that.
Yeah. Is that because the statistic about we really learn language before 8, and if we learn language after 8, we really don't become fluent in that language?
Right. If you think about, learning a high school second language, you're never going to know that language as well as your first language. And so knowing that we have this, like language window that we refer to that ends at, 7, 8 years old, if you're not getting input of the language that you're going to use for life in that time frame, then you're never going to learn it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, stressing that quality language exposure. Yeah, so you just recently moved to California and started this option school job. But before that, you were in Virginia.
I was right before California. I was in Virginia.
Okay.
And I worked in a self-contained classroom for children with autism.
Okay. And what were you doing working with children with autism as a teacher of the deaf?
So initially when I moved to Virginia, I was hired under the pretense that there would be an itinerant position for a teacher of the deaf. And after budget cuts were made that summer, the program for the deaf suffered. And so my position, as well as I think 2 others, were cut from the school system for that district. And so they offered me a close enough option that was more special education, not necessarily my qualifications, but they said, you'll do, essentially. So I was offered this job, and it was 2 weeks before the school year started. And I took it knowing that in research that I'd done in grad school, there are similarities in the learning styles of kids who are deaf and kids who have autism. And so I crossed my fingers and hoped that would be enough. Thankfully, I had a really wonderful mentor. And so she helped me kind of figure things out real quick. It was an interesting year. It was a year of growth for sure in my teaching style and my, classroom management and things like that. I definitely learned a lot about kids who have autism spectrum disorder, and some of which I've used post, that job. But it was not what I was hoping to be doing there.
Yeah. So you have like this interesting perspective, because there is sort of this misconception that kids who are deaf can just go into the special ed classroom and they'll be fine. Or they can go mainstream and they'll be fine. So either way, that's just like this two-way street that's really not correct. So what are the biggest differences that you've seen in working with kids with autism versus working with kids who are deaf?
I'd say the biggest difference right off the bat is that kids with autism, it's a huge spectrum. And so there are kids who are nonverbal, but the majority of the kids that I worked with all had language. And so right off the bat, you have children who have the language that their peers are speaking, who are able to understand the language of the teacher, who are able to function a little bit better in a classroom of their hearing of their typically developing peers. Whereas a student with hearing loss definitely needs that one-on-one instruction, that specific teaching, pre-teaching, post-teaching, review later on. I think that they're both pretty, I don't want to say unpredictable disabilities, but they both have their needs in different areas. And knowing what I know about teaching children who have hearing loss and knowing what I know about teaching children with autism, there's no way that someone should be qualified to, someone should be asked to do both, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences where in Hawaii I was asked to teach kids with autism for various reasons, and I think I'm wondering if like some of it is about the language development is much different. Like you said, there's access. Kids who are on the autism spectrum disorder, they have access to the language. They can hear it. They can see the sign language. If they can't verbalize, then they can sort of process it. It's like the processing is way different
Exactly.
than when a child who is born with any type degree of hearing loss, that creates like an access issue. They don't have the language coming to them, and they process it different.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, targeting those two different processing is it's different. It's two different ways of teaching them.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, if you think about it, like you're either, for a child with autism, building on language that they already have, or a child with hearing loss building language from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to progress at different rates. They're going to need different things. There's going to be, like you said, just huge difference in access to language, to sound, to, communication in general.
Right. Yeah. And then there's the whole discussion about introducing sign language to kids with hearing loss versus introducing sign language to kids who are nonverbal or on the ASD, on the autism spectrum disorder. So how, I guess the implications of like introducing sign language to kids with hearing loss, from my experience, it's been sometimes difficult for them to have both at the same time, simultaneously listening to spoken language and sign language at the same time. Whereas a child who has autism needs that sign language to access the spoken language.
Yeah, definitely. So for kids with autism, a lot of the time it's referred to as sign support.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really is just that. It's, the inability to vocalize what I need to vocalize so I know I can sign it, or being signed to because maybe something isn't as clear in spoken language. And so it kind of works in conjunction. And so introducing sign isn't ever really a huge deal because it's helpful to children with autism. Whereas kids with hearing loss, if you're going to choose spoken language, then you have to focus on spoken language, and you have to provide that, quality language exposure. You have to provide that access to sound, and you have to really be consistent with it. Trying to teach a child spoken language and sign at the same time isn't going to be as effective. And from my personal experience, they're not making as much progress overall, and they're not going to make progress as quickly. There really needs to be that consistent and quality input of spoken language if that's the path that's being chosen. And so introducing sign is almost, not to say that you're giving up on spoken language, but it's a little bit, you're having to accept the fact that maybe spoken language isn't the path that's going to be the most successful for that child, or that child just isn't going to make the progress that you had hoped. I think that it's a big difference in making that decision that you really need to take into account, like later on down the road, where it's hard to think, when a child is 2-3 years old, what that's going to look like in 10 or 15 years. But as a parent and as an educator, you really have to kind of step back and say, what's this child showing us right now, the progress that they're making, the access to sound that they have, and, the quality of language that they're going to be exposed to. And is sign going to be a hindrance to learning spoken language, or is it going to be, what they really need?
Right. Yeah, there's so many different factors than just like, let's do one or the other. Because something else I talk to families in Hawaii about, because there's a lot of beach time and there's time around water that devices are not being worn. So if there's less device use, then what kind of language would you use or be necessary to use on the beach that might provide for more safety? And then how could we implement that without the regression of their spoken language? And and talk about like options. Yeah. So it is tricky, isn't it? I know. But I think the biggest point is just like the consideration is very individualized for each child based on like how they can develop their language and based on the family's language in the home and their ability to learn sign language if they choose to introduce sign language to their child. So a lot of things to consider.
Yeah. Geez, I don't know. That's kind of, I know that's not something we encounter here as often.
Right. Yeah. In the mainland, huh?
I don't know. My gut instinct is just to like, there's so many options for waterware for devices now that it's hard to say, you know, you can't wear your devices to the beach, or you can't, you know, wear your devices if you're kayaking or whatever you might be doing. I don't know.
Yeah. Pool time. Absolutely. I encourage device wear because there's no big wave that's going to pull the device off the child's head. But even at the ocean, you know, you can use a Huggy and then clip the device possibly to the suit. But there's a lot of issues that come up with the ocean pulling the device off. So yeah, maybe just go in the water, take it off, come out, put it back on.
Right.
Yeah, different ways to look at it.
I agree with that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we'll put that out there. I'm wondering also what happened to your kids in Virginia when the program was no more, when it was canceled at the district you were at.
So they kept a few itinerant teachers. The problem with that, though, is that then the itinerant teacher's caseload maybe doubled or tripled. And so to expect one person to be able to see every student on their caseload for the appropriate amount of minutes that they're supposed to see them for their, you know, per their IEP, I can't say that it all happened. There's no way that it would have all happened. And it's kind of sad to think there's all those kids who are now stuck in the mainstream without a program, a real program at least, without, you know, the proper services that they should be getting, how their schooling suffered and how, you know, their ability to make progress after already being behind probably just suffered that much more. And so it's scary that there's this common misbelief in the hearing community that if you just put hearing aids or a cochlear implant on a child, they're fine, and then they can go along with their peers, and similar to how you might put glasses on someone who can't see, and the problem is fixed and you're great and you can go right along with the rest of your kids. And that's not true at all. Kids with hearing loss, as you know, require that implicit or explicit instruction, that, you know, consistent and continued exposure to language and pre-teaching, and just there's so many pieces that have to work together and so much effort that has to be made both on the educator's part and the child's part, that to expect those things to happen in a typical classroom is naive at best.
Right. I mean, especially in that elementary level where maybe you would have had the position of being in the classroom with the student, but then this itinerant teacher is now coming in to work with the child, maybe, who knows, 1 hour a week, if at all. It's
if they're
hard
lucky.
to say. Yeah, it's hard to say when there's one person for a huge caseload and what that looks like. But I think, you know, to the point of what the naivete and the misconception is around kids with devices, especially even at that mild hearing loss. And there's this understanding that, there's this thought, not an understanding, it's a misunderstanding about the kids who have a mild hearing loss are better off and they are fine, whereas the kid with a profound hearing loss, they need more attention. But it's sort of all of it. A mild, moderate, severe, profound, all of it needs the attention.
Absolutely. The kind of on that same token, there's kids with unilateral losses who are very often being left without services because people think, they have one ear that can hear. If they're wearing a hearing aid or a focus or something on the other side, they're fine. They're probably going to be fine. They're getting at least half of everything. It'll be fine. And so I've seen quite a few kids actually who are coming to listening and spoken language programs later on down the road, maybe 3, 4, or 5 years old, because they start preschool or kindergarten and they're nowhere near the functionality that they need to be at. And there's unfortunately kids probably who I could have had in Virginia who were, like you said, mild hearing loss, hearing aid users, or unilateral kids, or even kids who seem to be doing really well, like kids with implants who have been in a listening and spoken language program and then have mainstreamed on purpose, because they're making so much progress. But then without those continued services, they can start to regress just as easily as a kid who is maybe, just functioning with a mild hearing loss and isn't getting anything either. I mean, it's even kids who are doing really well, you have to be continually, working hard to keep that progress up and to help maintain the school, the education that they've gotten thus far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in terms of like the families who may not know until the age 3 that their child is not at the same level as their peers, what can we do to talk to them about their babies from birth to 3? Like, what are the 3 biggest things we can tell them about hearing loss before their child is even supposed to be talking?
3 biggest things.
Or one. Maybe one. I think I can think of one, but I mean, device use. We've already
Yes,
kind of touched
absolutely.
on.
My number one would be put the devices on, keep them on, consistently use them, and make sure that the batteries are working, they're charging them if they can be charged, that the child has them on as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. All waking hours is what we learned.
All waking hours.
Yeah.
I guess my next 2 would have to be, I always tell my parents to find language in anything. I think that there's this misconception when you go to a program that provides services for kids, that you see all these great toys and these thought out lessons and these, intricate art projects and things, that you have to have all that to provide language. And that's not true in the least. I tell my parents anytime I can that they need to be pulling language out of every part of their day. If you're at the grocery store, you can talk about a billion different things to buy or not buy, or how it's on a high shelf or a low shelf, or the juice was empty, so we have to buy more. You could go to the park and talk about different playground equipment or other kids or nature. I mean, there's language in the smallest parts of your day: taking a bath, getting dressed, going to the bathroom, eating dinner, just noticing that in any time of day there is language that needs to be brought out and that child needs to be exposed to it. I call it pulling language out of nowhere, but it really is everywhere. I mean, you can talk about anything. Your child needs to hear that language. Your child it's narration, essentially. It's just talking about everything you're doing, like folding laundry. Seems really minute to you because you do it every day, but you already have the language for it and you've heard it before. Your child hasn't, and they're not going to learn it unless you give it to them.
Yeah.
Um,
Especially because they don't have the overhearing, right? I mean, parents might be talking to each other, but the child's not going to hear that unless they're talking directly to the child.
Absolutely. Knowing that overhearing isn't happening is huge.
Yeah. What's the statistic on overhearing? Like, we learn a lot of our language from overhearing.
Yeah, I think it's like 60 or 70.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It was a huge percentage. It was over 50% of our language is learned from overhearing.
Absolutely.
And if a child who is a hearing loss,
you're not getting any of that.
They're not getting any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is scary.
Yeah. And so that explicit teaching comes in, and that's where we get to coach parents and say, talk to your child about everything you're doing.
Nonstop exposure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So device use and exposure to language as much as possible.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Maybe to the point about your unilateral hearing loss idea, like why can't a child with a unilateral hearing loss who has one good ear be okay?
Well, the biggest thing is the inability to localize. If you're only getting input from one side, then you're never sure of where things are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
As people with two typically hearing ears, there's so much science that goes on inside your brain that tells your brain, it got to this ear first, so it's on this side of you, or, it got to the ears at the same time, so it's in front or behind. I mean, just little things like that kids with one ear who can't hear aren't getting.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they lack the inability to overhear a lot because they're only getting 50% of what's happening around them. So if you're expecting them to focus on things that are happening close, like a conversation or, a game or a TV show, but also hear what's going on elsewhere, you can't focus on two things at once. It's just not going to happen. Your brain can't process input like that from, two different acoustic sources in the same way at the same time. And so they're missing out on so much that to expect them to just be okay with 50% is like, asking someone with two arms to do the same thing that someone with one arm can do. I mean, or vice versa.
Right, exactly.
So
yeah.
It's just not fair. It's not a fair assumption to make, and it's not a fair expectation to have of those kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I know it's basically that there's things that are being missed, and we can come to this understanding that they need something different than kids who have autism, kids who are typically hearing, and it's our job to make sure that this happens.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks so much for your time. I could go on and on about this. I miss talking about this with colleagues and classmates. And
I never realized, having started out in a place where deaf education is so prominent, and working 3 years at an option school and then moving away, I never realized how true it is that we really are few and far between. I mean, there are not enough quality deaf educators in this country. There are not enough quality programs. And there are not enough people to be able to bounce ideas off of and have these kinds of talks where we can make real progress.
Right.
And so it's nice to have colleagues around the world where you can jump in and compare and contrast and figure things out. So this is great.
Yeah, it's good to learn about what's happening everywhere else, and good to catch up with you. Thank you. Yeah. All right. We'll talk soon. Thanks, Melissa. Okay.